Sabbath school lesson is about the new covenant life. And it just struck me as I looked at the title, the new covenant life sounds like a great and wonderful thing, but it just contrasted in my mind with the current state of Christianity, both in America, and since the Adventist Church is part of America, we're not immune from these trends. And so really it applies to the Adventist Church as well. And a fair question is, if your new life or your new covenant life is so good, why don't your kids want it? And I have to make it relevant to young adults and old young adults. So we might say, not all of you have kids, I understand that. So we might say your peers, right? If you're 20, you don't have kids yet, probably. But you have friends, younger friends, older friends, that have chosen, that aren't here at Sabbath school, that haven't chosen to involve themselves in church. And if we understand the statistics properly, it's actually more that choose not to than those that choose to continue, right? It's a study done a few years ago about 70% of Adventist young people, when they leave Adventist school, they stop going to church, either academy or college. Then they have their first choices and they stop going. Now, it's not a for all time figure, because further studies have shown that when these same individuals get married, and especially when they have kids, that at least some of them are coming back. But we're not sure how true that is these days, whether they're still coming back. And this is just to share some more contemporary statistics with you. The Pew Research Center found that 27%, only 27% of millennials, 1 out of 4, say they attend religious services on a regular or weekly basis. And that compares with about 38% of baby boomers. So it's a drop of 11%. And only about half of millennials say they believe in God with absolute certainty. 1 in 10 say religion is very important in their lives. Something that really struck me, though, that put all this in perspective, in about 2008, so just over about 12 years ago now, nearly half of Americans said they went to church on a regular basis. It was like 45, 47% of Americans said they went to church on a regular basis, which was astronomical compared with countries in Western Europe, where you might get 2 or 3% that would say that. So it was a very positive number, but an outlier among Western nations. But just 12 years later, that number has dropped almost in half. So now, about 1 in 4, 25% of Americans qualify as a practicing Christian, right? There are many more who will identify as culturally Christian, or say I'm Christian or Protestant. If they actually go to church, study the Bible and pray, 45 to 25%. I'm like, wow, you know, it stayed at 50% for decades. And then suddenly in the course of 1 decade, we've had a real drop off. I guess what happened in 2008? I suppose it was the beginning of the Obama years, 2 terms, 2008 to 2016, of a very far left administration, and maybe a reaction against it by the far right that many young people did not find attractive. So which one is more to blame, the far left influences or the far right influences? Maybe a combination of the two. Then, of course, the Trump years come along, and while that puts evangelicals in power in some ways, it doesn't necessarily make them more attractive to young people. And so the numbers stay low. So you have a rebound to a Republican administration, but the numbers actually involved in church don't go up. David Kinnaman, the president of Barna, said, a lot of research tracks single factors such as church attendance, but the practicing Christian measure is unique in that it combines 3 variables: calling oneself a Christian, strongly prioritizing faith and regular church attendance. Because each of those 3 factors have declined over the last 20 years among all adults, The net effect shows the major reshuffling of American spiritual lives. Monthly committed churchgoers are now about half as common as they were 2 decades ago. The shift has major repercussions for church leaders as there's an increased struggle to attract and retain the active segment of churchgoers. And he tries to end on a positive note that even though only 1/4 of the population qualifies as actively Christian, this represents more than 80 million Americans. I mean, it's a large number, and this is a level of church-going that is a statistical outlier among affluent and educated societies. So he's comparing us again with Western Europe and Australia, and he's saying, well, they're doing really badly. At least we're still doing better than they're doing. But that's really kind of not very encouraging. The reality is, in 10 years, we've lost essentially half of the population of church-going Americans, of those Americans actively involved in their Christian faith. I don't know if there's anybody has any thoughts or comments on just those facts and statistics. Are you surprised by the level of the drop? I was. I didn't know that it had declined that badly. The numbers show that about half those leaving went to become sort of atheists and agnostics. The other half went to just become kind of cultural Christians, non-involved. Do you have any thoughts about why, the reasons for this? Has this impacted the Adventist Church, do you think? You're all smart, long-term leadership type Christians. How do you react to is this the future? Are we responding to these changes adequately as a church?
I have a couple of questions for you, Nick.
All right, William.
The first one is if there's any corresponding research about anti-religious content in the media, and if there's any corresponding research about the percentage of students that have had at least some secular higher education in that period of time.
So those are both good questions, and I don't think you would find that. I'll start with the second one about an increase in secular education. I don't think you would find a proportionate increase suddenly in like young Americans having access to higher education during this period of time. I would say it's at least remained static and maybe even gone down due to economic and social and other pressures. But I don't think you're going to find that's a significant variable in it. It is interesting to note that, after World War II, the GI Bill sent many, lower income, lower middle class Americans to college for the first time. But blacks were largely not included in that program. Either they didn't get the money or the schools wouldn't accept them. The white community became much more secularized than the black community did. So there is a correlation, as you suggest, William, between people who get collegiate and higher education and those that trend more secular. But I don't think that explains what's happened over the last 10 years. We have a comment in the room. Go ahead.
I really like that comment. It kind of goes along with what I remember being in Loma Linda 2008 for the crash. There was a lot of these idea of the prosperous gospel. It was the main trend in Christianity at that time. So the prosperity gospel. A lot of people preaching, among everybody, and even within our church, little groups of people preaching about these prosperity gospel. The idea, the principle behind that. Then 2008 comes and and something happens. This is just my experience where I was in 2008.
So there was an economic crash in 2008. We should also point out, it wasn't just the election of Obama, but before Obama is elected, there's this crash economically. And it's interesting. And so you're saying preaching the prosperity gospel, and suddenly there's an economic crash, and it kind of undermines the prosperity gospel. Because sometimes when there's economic crashes, people will tend to turn more towards God, right? There's less reliance on. I don't know, your first point, Will, I'm not quite sure. You're wondering if maybe Hollywood and the media have been more anti-religious in the last decade or so than previously. I don't know how, I haven't seen any studies on that. I know there's been a certain level of hostility for more than a decade, but maybe it's been more open for the last decade and a half. I don't know. What point are you making with that? If you'd like to comment.
I don't know that I was making a point. It occurred to me that it feels like in my lifetime, and particularly in the recent past, that the amount of anti-Christian, anti-religious kind of things that I see in the news, not so much Hollywood kind of has been mostly anti-religious for a long time, but the news content and social media content and those kinds of things seems like it has moved in a progressively anti-religious direction to me. It's just what it feels like to me. I don't know that there's reality behind that. I don't know if there's any kind of research that demonstrates that the sort of general public perception of Christianity has changed dramatically in that period of time, but it feels like it to me.
Well, I think you're onto something in terms of, in 2008, economic crash, Obama's elected, but you remember the first time he was elected, he was actually in defense of traditional marriage. Bill Clinton signed the Defense of Marriage Act. Obama ran on a platform of defending traditional marriage. It was about halfway through his first term, maybe 2/3 of the way, that he began to shift. And by the time his second election came along, he was actually openly supporting gay marriage. And I do think that there was a cultural shift between about 2005 and 2010, where the media decided LGBT were the new civil rights, and anyone who was opposed to it was bigoted. And therefore, all conservative Christian religion and other religions, could be openly criticized on these grounds. And I think there's something to that, Will. Since about 2010, there's been much more willingness of the media to try to marginalize traditional conservative religion because of its values on gender and sexuality. And I would say the divide on that has become much more open, and the press has been much more willing or unwilling to give the conservative Christian viewpoint a fair hearing or view it as positive in any way. So that might be right. Somebody's made a comment, leadership and authority has proven unfaithful. I do think that coming to the lesson, the text is, I am come that they might have life and that they might have it more abundantly, John 10:10. And it seems to me that Christians have not done a good job at persuading the next generation that the Christian life is really the more abundant life, right? And I put up a little posting on my Facebook page today that said millennials are not wanting to trade a lifetime of fun, adventure, and excitement for an eternity of boredom, right? If they view you're offering them eternal life, but the life that they see is not as exciting and as attractive, even if it lasted forever, as the life they think they can have on their own terms. I mean, it seems fundamentally to me that people are voting with their feet and where they want to go, because it will be the most satisfying place to go. And we've kind of passed the time where we can threaten people with, hell, because they don't really believe in hell. And well, maybe there's going to be a heaven, but if your life is any reflection of what heaven is like, we don't want to go there either. And we're just going to live the life that we know we have now in the way that we think will bring us the greatest happiness and pleasure. And so I think it was appropriate. The Sabbath school lesson began with this topic on Sunday with joy. And they quote, for 1 John chapter 1, these things write we unto you, that your joy may be full. Some translations say that our joy may be full. I think John was interested in everyone's joy being full, his and theirs and ours. And I think that it's interesting they start with joy and not with, what else could they have started with? What else would you have associated with the eternal life, right? What is God like? What is a Christian like? What's the first word that comes to mind? A Christian should be, God is love, right? And yet, and millennials are certainly attracted to love, but the Sabbath school lesson starts with this idea of joy. And I think there may be some wisdom to it, because love, we've often said and told our young people, isn't primarily a feeling. Love isn't a feeling or an emotion, it's a what?
Principle.
It's a principle. And you commit yourself to love other people no matter how you feel about them, right? So you're supposed to love your enemies. Now that doesn't sound very fun, and it may not feel very good, but it's this kind of, you do your duty by approaching other people with this positive outlook. And Christians don't say that love doesn't involve feeling, but we do tend to put this emphasis on the principle of the thing, because feelings change and they come and they go. But when you speak about joy, is it possible really to speak about joy in the absence of some kind of positive feeling about life and the approach to life? And I suppose even in moments of sadness, the funeral I was at yesterday, there's even a joy there in reflecting on the kind of man that Pastor Morales was and the way he liked playing with children. This was one of his great passions, was children's ministry, and the sense of humor he had. And there was no denying the joy that he had and the joy that we even have as we reflect on him, even while we're sad that he's gone. So this sense of joy seems to suggest a positive outlook and feeling and experience in ways that love doesn't. So I want to focus on this question of joy. There's a series of texts that I want to look up. Maybe I can write them down on the board. Do we have a pen and get some people Bibles? Psalm 4, verses 6 to 7. Milton, do you have a Bible? Maybe
Yes.
you can look that one up.
Psalm
4, 6 to 7, and then Psalm 16, 11, Ecclesiastes 22, 26. Henry, can you look up the Psalm 16, 11? Somebody online, Ecclesiastes 22 to 26. Kira, can you look up that, Ecclesiastes 22 to 26?
There's no chapter 22 in Ecclesiastes.
Must have a, yeah, you're right. What do I, it must be 2.
2? Okay.
Ecclesiastes 5, 18 to 20. Who else do we have online that I can, Will, could you help us with that one? 5, 18 to 20. And then Ecclesiastes 9, 7. What about Jon from Iceland? Ecclesiastes 9, 7. I want somebody reading from Iceland. Okay, let's start with Psalm 4, verses 6 to 7. Milton.
There are many who say, who will show us any good? Lord, lift up the light of your countenance upon us. You have put gladness in my heart, more than in the season that their grain and wine increased.
You put gladness, that version says. Others say you put joy in my heart. Good. Gift from God of joy. Okay, Psalm 16:11. I think Henry.
Okay, Psalm 16 verse 11 says, "You will show me the path of life. In your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore."
So Psalm 16, in your presence is fullness of joy. At your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Right? Sometimes as Christians we talk about worldly pleasures. Well, apparently there's heavenly pleasures, right? And this is what seeking the presence of God is, to bring this joy and this pleasure. Ecclesiastes 22:26, 2:26. Kira, does it make sense? Is there joy in it?
Yep, there's joy. It's like joy in the first half. I don't know if you just want me to read the first half, but I can read the whole thing. So Ecclesiastes 2:26, "For God gives wisdom and knowledge and joy to a man who is good in his sight. But to the sinner he gives the work of gathering and collecting, that he may give to him who is good before God. This also is vanity and grasping for the wind."
Good. So the second is the workaholic, right? The workaholic is seeking the things of this world, and actually in the end, in pursuit of the things of this world, crowds out the space that God gives the person of faith to have joy. Because we know that things don't bring joy, it's relationships and experience. All right, Ecclesiastes 5:18-20.
Here's what I have seen. It is good and fitting for one to eat and drink and to enjoy the good of all his labor, in which he toils under the sun, all the days of his life which God gives him, for it is his heritage. As for every man to whom God has given riches and wealth, and given him power to eat of it, to receive his heritage and rejoice in his labor, this is the gift of God, for he will not dwell unduly on the days of his life, because God keeps him busy with the joy of his heart.
Okay, again, the central role of joy in the book of Ecclesiastes, and then 9:7 is the final verse.
Go eat your bread with joy and drink your wine with a merry heart, for God has already approved what you do.
For God has already approved what you do. Wow, that's a significant verse for people that are fearful about God's judgment on their lives, right? Go and eat and drink with joy. What fundamentally brings joy? We've read all these verses about how joy is a gift from God, and yet we know that with God's other gifts, there's also a role for the human to play, right? That often you need to cultivate faith and hope and love. And presumably you also need to make choices to help cultivate joy. Very rarely does God give a gift that he just is 100% entirely from him with no effort on your part. In light of these texts, in light of your experiences, what is it that helps bring about joy in your life?
I would say maybe fulfillment or satisfaction.
Okay. Okay, very good. What kind of fulfillment and satisfaction?
Like when you're done with homework.
So in other words, work brings you joy.
Like being done with it.
So it's not the work itself, but after you've done the work, you feel happy.
Especially if it's productive work. Like,
That's productive work. Now, you were going to say, Milton?
Yeah, I was going to say in spiritual discussions, we get joy not only thinking about the eternal things hereafter, but the text is also saying the things that satisfies us daily here, food, drink, and all that stuff, and our fruits of labor. When we do those things and enjoy those things, this brings also pleasure and blessing of God.
Now, these are very good Adventist answers. And I want to suggest to you that these answers are right, but they're not exhaustively right. And part of the problem with Adventism is that we have so emphasized these particular answers: find something productive, follow the pathway of enhancing your skills, and do good work, and it will bring satisfaction. And this is the message of the book of Proverbs. Go to the ant, thou sluggard, consider her ways and be wise, right? The slothful man in his bed and is not ready for the harvest. And yes, God has called us all and given us skills that we need to go and use and do these things. And Adventists are experts at this, right? We know about the law and the law of health and the law of having a satisfactory life. And I was certainly raised that way and came to a point where I said, yes, I want to further and advance my God-given skills and accomplish and do well. And that's good, but it also lies down a pathway of workaholism, where actually, in a sense, this is the foundation of joy, but it's not necessarily the thing itself. I mean, it's good to have pleasure in your work, but it's work, right? Do you live to work or do you work to live? And so many Adventists are so caught up in that work is good that the work becomes an end in itself, right? And I was looking through Ecclesiastes 3. There's a time for everything under the sun. And I couldn't remember if there was a couplet that said there's a time to work and there's a time to play. Does anyone know if it's there? It's not, actually. I went and looked, but there's a couple of couplets, if you will, that are suggestive of that. There's a time, well, my wife suggested a time to cast away stones and a time to gather stones. Here's my dear wife now coming in the door. The idea of casting away stones sounds like kind of sort of playful activity, and building, collecting. I'm not sure about that one, but a time to weep and a time to laugh. Laughter is a kind of play, and a time to mourn and a time to dance. We know dancing is kind of the essential definition of play, where there's physical activity for no purposeful end other than the joy itself, right? And then I went over to Ecclesiastes 4, 7, and 8. And I think this, again, it doesn't use precisely the words, but I think it makes the point. Again, I saw vanity under the sun. One person who has no other, either son or brother, and yet there is no end to all his toil, and his eyes are never satisfied with riches, so that he never asks, for whom am I toiling and depriving myself of pleasure? This also is vanity and an unhappy business, right? There's this pleasures at the right hand of God. Shouldn't there be pleasures in this life? Shouldn't work give way to play and play give way to work? And as Adventists, if the work is never giving way, if everything has to be useful and utilitarian, are our young people becoming unpersuaded that this is a life they want to live for the 70 or 80 years they have on this earth, much less for eternity? There's a study that actually supports this position that I'm raising here. Martin Weber is an Adventist pastor. He's a chaplain now. He's written some books. You may be familiar with him. He did a doctor of ministry where he studied pastors who had adult children, and to find out who was in the church and who was out of the church, and what the factors were in helping either keep them in the church or causing them to leave the church. You can find it easily by Googling Martin Weber and keeping our kids in the church. And he did this survey of 222 active and retired clergy. And he came with these findings. There were 40 factors yielding reasons that people left the church, pastors' kids left the church. Parental conservatism regarding lifestyle standards was not a statistically significant issue in attrition. So just because you had a conservative family with conservative lifestyle standards didn't make the kids more likely to leave. Legalism regarding the gospel did make it more likely that they would leave, right? So there's a difference between conservative values and legalistic implementation. Another reason was clergy parents holding their own children to higher behavioral standards than the others. So this is an interesting point. But the point that struck me most directly and relates to this lesson is that lack of relationality in the pastoral family is the most serious cause of PK attrition. Pastors with the highest retention rate of adult children are those who manage to provide the most positive and fun family experience in the parsonage. And we're close enough to talk about anything in an atmosphere of freedom with their children. So to break it down, we know that these pastors are hardworking people and are passing that ethic along to their children. So they had that foundation, right? Let's acknowledge that hard work and discipline is important. But if that's all you have, then your kids aren't likely to stay. But if on top of that foundation, you can actually have fun with them, it creates an atmosphere of freedom and relationship that causes it to have situations where you're more likely to pass on your values. And the children are more likely to view this life and lifestyle as positive and desirable, and they'll want to choose it, right? So it's not about just entertaining people and having fun all the time, right? Don't get me wrong, but there's this foundation that's important, but not adequate. And it made me think, as adults, do we know really what it is to have fun? Even when we play with our kids, do we play with them out of a sense of duty, right? And that they're kids, they need to have somebody play with them? Or are we able to enter into it as children lose themselves in fun, right? It's like an escape from the realities of the world, and you can overdo it and so on and so forth. But as adults, do we lose that capability to enter into play and enter into the enjoyment of it ourselves? Because if we don't, our kids will know, right? Our kids, when we're playing with them, if we're doing that of a sense of duty or of, we're doing this because you want us to do this, they know, they can tell, right? If you're not entering into it, into the spirit of it. And I think all these texts on joy, this is what they're pointing to, right? Can you have spontaneous joy and happiness in your life? Well, I do want to leave, is there questions? Is it Will? Yeah, sorry, Will.
No worries. I just was thinking that the verses that you had me read in Ecclesiastes 5 imply a level of contentment with having accomplished work, that you are at a place where life doesn't require work for you to be able to relax and enjoy the proceeds of your work, essentially. So it goes along with what you're saying, that through much of Ecclesiastes, Solomon suggests that labor itself is arduous and painful and annoying and frustrating and vanity and those kinds of things. But in this verse here, it suggests that for the person who's given the power to eat of it or to enjoy the results of, is the person who actually gets to experience joy. And that there's a level of contentment with and having necessities met that sort of is often a precursor to being able to enjoy. There's some danger in looking at that, looking at having things as necessary to be able to enjoy life, but the underlying idea that contentment with what you have has to be there, so you're not a slave to working harder before you can enjoy what really is in life to enjoy.
Right. No, I think that's well put. And there has to be the ability to find joy and enjoyment in the things you have presently, without that joy being dependent on something you're going to add to it in the future, or you're just caught in the cycle of, again, needing to get and get and get. Let's break into our groups for a few minutes, and I suppose the questions, I haven't written them out at this point, but the 2 or 3 questions I have is, you know, how as Adventists have we perhaps overlooked this joy component of relating with our young people? What is it that we could do better in connecting with them in this way? What is it that brings us joy? Sometimes we lose sight of that, right? We have all these things, this checklist of things to do. Are there things we can point to in our lives that bring us genuine joy that we can share with our children and help them have joy as well? Anyway, I think there's enough to talk about that. All right, welcome back from your journey into joy. I've got a couple of comments in this room that I'd like to have shared. Anthony shared something, and Milton and Henry, but anyone on the groups there have a point or two that deserves broader acknowledgement? We're recording again, so we'll preserve these for posterity. What can we do better about joy in our lives and in our church? Why have we overlooked it? Do we even know what brings us joy?
In our group, we talked a lot about community and like kind of intergenerational community in a way, and mentorship. Because we talked a lot about how a lot of the joy that we found was like when we were kids, and you know, we'd have all these different socials and activities and just fun things that we would do at church, and that kind of disappears once you enter like that college, young adult, like postgraduate life. And we talked about how just having this connection between, you know, the potentially like more mature or older leaders in the church to the like young adults to the teenagers, and giving them space to own pieces of, you know, the church, whether it's, you know, in a service or volunteering in something, but just making sure that we're all connected in a way that we can feel like we're a part of a community, and be able to also just, you know, be together and fellowship together, eat together on a regular basis.
That's really good. We also talked about the connectivity between joy and family, and talked about the Latin community has in some ways a stronger sense of family and community, and they seem to become joyful maybe more easily than some of our other cultures. Henry from New Guinea talked about the especially the rural pastors having more time in their lives for family and for joy. I do think, you know, it's interesting. Joy is a kind of individual experience at some level, but it seems to happen very much in community. And one of the important features of joy, and it's interesting that, like, so I'm part of the band of surfers, and we think of ourselves as very individualistic. But after you've had a great ride, you look around to see if anybody else was able to see it and enjoy it with you, right? There seems to be a really important social element to joy. So that's well stated. Anyone else? Any other group?
I think in line with what you had suggested there, Nick, it just made me think of a statement that I've heard a few times over the course of my life, that joy shared is twice joy, and pain shared is half pain.
It's good.
That reality of community where joy and ownership of life in church is shared is the places where that joy can happen. And when there's not that community and that shared ownership, it's a lot harder for that to happen unless you intentionally create it outside of church.
It's good. Sports teams get this, don't they? Whenever something great happens at a sporting event, somebody makes a good play, everyone's immediately high-fiving or bumping chests or sharing and building the joy. But also I've noticed in basketball, when somebody misses a free throw, half the team still gives them a high five, right? It's kind of like your point of sharing the pain, of encouraging them, of being part of the group. What if we did that as Christians in our churches, right? We celebrate the joyous times together more than we do, but also we want to connect and pick people up and celebrate in them, even with their difficult times.
That means allowing the bench warmers to get in the game.
Yes, I agree, Will. Anthony shared a couple of thoughts with us that I wanted him to share with the larger group.
Sure. So I was just saying that one of the preconditions to joy is often a sense of security, that joy is inherently risky or dangerous. And so because you can lose that joy, you might experience that joy, and then there's a loss of that joy. And when you're in a condition of economic insecurity, especially in the last decade or two, where young adults feel like I can't afford to experience joy because while I'm experiencing joy, I'm getting behind, and I need to be getting ahead. I have to compete on this global scale. It's often felt that joy is only something that can be enjoyed once you've made it, once you've achieved it. And so I think this is where the role of grace comes in, where we can take a posture of grace and say, joy isn't something that we earn, isn't something that we merit, but a joy is a gift that's given to us, and therefore we are free to graciously accept it and experience it.
So we need to wrap up here, so I'll just share a thought, unless there's another hand, in closing. We've often pointed out that Adventists live 10 years longer, 8 to 10 years longer than the rest of the population. And when I was younger, I had some friends who were on the verge of leaving church or were leaving church, and they said, no, Adventists don't live longer, it just feels that way. You just have a boring life, and I think that it reflects this, what I referenced earlier, right? You're not going to, death is the one thing that postmodernism can't deconstruct, right? It can deconstruct all our other values and beliefs and show that we can't absolutely prove them. It can make a good case for nihilism at some level. I don't think it's ultimately persuasive, but it's hard to refute in a black and white way. But postmodernists die at the end of the day, right? No postmodernism has deconstructed the reality of the physical world we live in and the fact that Michel Foucault is dead now, and Derrida is dead, and all of them are dead. And in a sense, what the apostles said about Christ having the words of life is still true, right? Christianity does offer this hope beyond the grave. But I think we've come to a point where that itself doesn't seem to be enough, right? That they're not willing to trade in an eternity, a life of fun, adventure, and excitement for an eternity of boredom. Pascal's wager isn't getting the same traction as it used to. And it's more incumbent upon Christians to realize the importance of not just duty and work and production, but the joy and the relationships and the play and the pleasures that the Bible itself freely and openly talks about, how important those things are to our lives and to making a persuasive case for Christianity. The book of Proverbs I mentioned before, I think, is written to a kind of blue collar and younger section of society, people who need to learn to get out of bed and up off their backsides and go out and work and do. The book of Ecclesiastes is written to perhaps the more aristocratic classes who've learned that basic lesson and who train their children and young people to do and perform well, and who realize that that in itself isn't enough, that there has to be a recognition of the value and importance of the enjoyment of life and relationships. And I think Adventists have well internalized the book of Proverbs, and I think we're still struggling to understand the book of Ecclesiastes, which perhaps not coincidentally is one of the most postmodern books in the Bible in terms of not its ideology, but in terms of its kind of effect and environment of it and the way it talks about the world. So I think that there is much for us to learn in Ecclesiastes about how to bring a fuller and greater joy into our lives. Christ may dwell in our hearts, that being rooted and grounded in love, that we may be filled with all the fullness of God. And there's that amazing Ellen White quote talking about coming to the point in our conversion experience where our own desires are actually God's desires. And in the Christian life becomes doing those things that we most really want to do, which is in fact when you're at your most joyful. And I think that others can see it.